click on your name as it currently shows up in Zoom. This is where you can rename yourself. Feel free to go crazy with renaming yourself, but we'd like to suggest putting your name and your bureau or mission just to help folks in the breakout rooms as well. And finally, feel free to share and reflect on social media if you're so inclined, and otherwise embrace the experience in what we're going to be doing together for the next couple hours. So with that, and to kick us off, I will now turn things over to Maura Berry-Boyle, our Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. Maura will be sharing opening remarks and setting the stage for our event today. So with that, thank you very much, Maura, and over to you.
Thanks, Jessie, for that introduction, and good morning, everybody. I'm calling into the Zoom from the Ronald Reagan Building here in Washington, D.C., in the office with just a handful of people. And it's really nice to join you for this event, albeit virtually. It's great that we were able to, conduct such an in-depth analysis with Mercy Corps and to set aside this time for such an important discussion. I think we've all known for decades that the need to be leaning in with development assistance in areas of recurrent crises is so important. I know one for myself, and I see Dina Esposito there. We've known, it's been in this business a long time. I started off a long time ago, 30 years ago, working in Somalia, and I was managing USAID's OFDA account at the time, as well as their development assistance. And the challenges were real then, and the challenges are real now. But I think the exciting thing is sort of in the last decade, we've come up with this framework to look at our work with the umbrella of resilience and to really hone in the way that we do things, particularly in the aftermath of the 2011 East Africa famine. We really elevated that focus on resilience, and we invested in targeted areas, resilience programming to strengthen the sources of resilience for communities to reduce that need to returning year after year to the same places with humanitarian assistance. And we have found that resilience is really a powerful organizing agenda, and it's brought different groups together with a common purpose and a way of working. And so with resilience as an organizing frame, we've been able to really pursue collective impact in areas of recurrent and protracted crises. And we've seen that the approach can translate into impactful results on the ground. I think an example that we go to often is what we saw took place in Ethiopia, where we had invested in communities in the Ethiopian lowlands. And we saw that households in communities that USAID was able to reach with comprehensive resilience programming were much better able to withstand the impact of a drought in 2016 and able to maintain their food security, whereas other communities faced substantial decline. And over time, we found that, we're working in places. I think when we started off, a lot of the areas, we really focused on the issues of drought and famine, for example, most notably in the Sahel, but time and time again, we end up in the middle of a conflict zone. So if you look at our portfolio today, we see that in those areas where we're focusing our resilience programming, half of those countries are also affected by conflict. And so we're figuring out what this looks like in real time. And we hope that, we're able to continue to use this resilience lens to have the same sort of powerful role as an organizing framework for collective impact in the face of conflict-driven crises. And we also recognize that this means we need to learn from others and from each other and how to adapt our approaches. And I really appreciate how this thought piece that Mercy Corps worked on makes the pitch for the important role of resilience that it can play, and also how it sheds light on what we need to be doing differently to make that a reality. And the timing of having this discussion, I think, as USAID is moving ahead with its transformation. I'm really excited that the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance was just stood up a few weeks ago, and we hope to see soon that the Conflict Prevention and Stabilization Bureau will be stood up. And we all, as you know, will come under this umbrella of R3. And, R3 has already begun operating. leading us to be a more nimble and field-focused agency. And the 3 bureaus are working under an associate administrator. At the moment, Trey Hicks is playing that role. And the arrangement really brings together, the agency's capabilities to, more strategically tackle some of the world's most difficult humanitarian and development challenges. And so I think that, having this closer alignment of capabilities and the collaboration among our investments is really going to help us advance our foreign assistance, our national security goals, and it really better supports the global counterparts on our journey to self-reliance. So just wanted to give those few words as a start-off framing for what is going to be, I think, an in-depth discussion. You're going to break out into groups, and thank you for letting me join you this morning. So thanks again, and back over to you, Jesse.
Maura, thank you so much for those words. So now I'm going to shift to, with Maura's remarks in mind, why we brought this crew together and what we're hoping to do today. As most of you know from the invitation, we're using Mercy Corps' recent thought piece that Maura was describing as a hook to bring all of you together who are either thinking about resilience or collective impact or conflict and protracted crises, or maybe all of the above. And so building on this thought piece, we have 3 main goals for the morning that you can see on a slide that we'll share in just 1 second. But really the first goal is about exploring the relevance of a resilience agenda for advancing collective impact in these protracted crises. Sort of just like that broader point to the thought piece. But from there, and because we have such a good group of USAID colleagues with extensive and diverse experiences from all over the world, we also want to use our time with you to identify promising practices and barriers to advancing collective impact in these contexts. So the thought piece proposes 3 key promising practices. We're hoping to have a discussion with all of you about what resonates and what's missing with those practices and to get your own perspective on these things. And then towards the end of our time together, we'd like to pivot to thinking about next steps. What should we be doing differently? What could we start doing tomorrow? And from my perspective too, we're thinking about this broadly. So this is across partners in USAID, both in Washington and at our missions. So with those broad goals in mind, I'll just walk us through what the rest of the morning is going to look like. So we've already heard from Maura, which is wonderful. And up ahead, we're going to hear highlights and key takeaways from our Mercy Corps colleagues on the thought piece towards resilience. So this has been linked in the invitation, but it's absolutely fine if you did not get a chance to read it, even though I highly recommend it. We'll take about 15-20 minutes for those key takeaways and highlights from our Mercy Corps colleagues. Then we'll spend about 15 minutes in plenary just to get some initial reactions to the piece. And then we'll pivot to our breakout rooms. So this is really where we're hoping to have a more targeted conversation with all of you. After those breakouts, we'll wrap up together in plenary, and we'll hear from the other breakout groups, aim for some synthesis based on those breakout group discussions, and then discuss some of those next steps. So with that, I will now turn things over to Olga Petriniak and John Kurtz with Mercy Corps, but let me read their bios to you first. Olga Petriniak is the Senior Director for Global Resilience at Mercy Corps, where she provides strategic direction and technical oversight to Mercy Corps' global resilience portfolio across 4 regions to achieve impact at scale and advance thought leadership and resilience. She has 16 years work experience working with local and national governments, communities, and the private sector in conflict management, climate change adaptation, natural resource management, and market systems development. John Kurtz is Mercy Corps' Senior Director for Research and Learning, where he leads research and impact evaluation efforts. Prior to his current role, Mr. Kurtz worked with other international NGOs and UN agencies to improve their abilities to generate and use rigorous evidence to influence policies and drive strategic learning. Mr. Kurtz's research concentrates on identifying how humanitarian development action can best contribute to reducing conflict and strengthening resilience in crisis-prone contexts. Thanks in advance, Olga and John, and over to you now.
Thanks very much, Jesse, for those introductions, and Mara for your opening remarks. And thanks for inviting us to share some of our perspectives on this important topic of how to advance collective impact in conflict-driven crises that we know today face the compounding threats of COVID-19, layering crisis on top of crisis. And just as we're waiting to kind of get the slides up here, and before diving in, I guess I wanted to humbly start the presentation by perhaps stating the obvious, that we definitely do not have all the answers, and we also really look forward to garnering a lot of learning and insights from all of you. We do, however, hope that based on our program evidence and research, we can provide some fresh perspectives on this topic, or just bring key issues that perhaps aren't new but important to the forefront. And we certainly won't shy away from being a little provocative, and hopefully that will stir some really good discussion. With that, I wanted to kick us off just by highlighting the stark reality that despite our collective best efforts and billions of dollars in international assistance, we as an international community have not been able to fundamentally reverse trends in the growing number, duration, and complexity of conflict-driven crises around the globe, which we know now dominate humanitarian outlays. Today, the average conflict-driven crisis lasts an average of 9 years, and we are seeing that increasingly spare reserves of foreign assistance cannot keep pace with compounding needs in places like Somalia, South Sudan, and Northeast Nigeria, who are some of the largest year-on-year aid recipients. And I know many of you here have been part of a wider agenda, and actually all of us collectively, to put forward reforms that can address some of these challenges, including the Grand Bargain and the Triple Nexus, designed to layer humanitarian peace and development action to achieve better outcomes in these contexts. And while all important, I guess today we want to offer that these reforms are still insufficient and put forward resilience as an organizing framework for guiding collective impact and collective action in protracted crises. And I hope this presentation can provide some justification for that and highlight the key ingredients to success. Next slide, please. So before going any further, I want to step back and provide a definition of what we mean by resilience, which is a topic that has often been misunderstood or perhaps misapplied before we grapple with its application to even more complex topics like conflict and protracted crises. The resilience is fundamentally about the capacity or the abilities within people and the systems they live in and rely on to maintain or improve human well-being, things like food security or health, in the face of unexpected shocks like drought, displacement, or a pandemic. And COVID-19 today certainly brings to the forefront the importance of having access to resilience capacities, like reliable information, public trust, public education, or nimble services and industries that can quickly pivot to ensure that, for example, a single health shock does not have long-lasting negative social and economic effects. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier by Mara, we have seen clear wins from investments in a resilience agenda in contexts defined by recurrent shocks. And this is primarily ecological and climate-related disasters like drought or flooding. And as Mercy Corps, we have been very fortunate to contribute to the global body of practice and evidence, including in close partnership with USAID and the Center for Resilience, that shows investing in resilience capacities does help communities cope, adapt, and transform in the face of these risks, as measured by their ability to maintain food security status, assets, and income, for example, following a drought. And while there are a lot of nuances to this, this evidence has motivated the alignment of humanitarian and development assistance towards building sources of resilience that have been proven to protect and advance long-term development gains. It has also fostered greater investments in multi-year, multi-sector assistance, which have been fundamental to the success of a resilience agenda in crisis context. Next slide. So given these wins and the global trends cited earlier, we set out to test whether the resilience approach that served as such a strong organizing framework for action with clear returns on investments in recurrent crises could somehow serve as a compass that guides action to improve the effectiveness and alignment of foreign assistance, humanitarian development, and peace building in protracted conflict-driven crises. And in key ways, these contexts were fundamentally different because here, conflict shocks were the primary drivers of food security and hunger as opposed to natural disasters. And governments are feeble at best, and if not outright predatory in many of these contexts, and therefore could not serve as a clear partner in strengthening resilience capacity. And we asked this question for a few reasons, and largely because we saw that the commitments made under the Great Bargain and the Triple Nexus were not really set up to fully deliver on their promise for several reasons. First and foremost, I think we can all agree that collective outcomes have not consistently been defined, and we thought that resilience might have a strong offering there. This also connects to the second challenge, which is this idea that any potential benefits of layering humanitarian development and peace-building assistance could be nullified or even have potential to do harm in the absence of reinforcing ways of working across these funding streams. And we've seen, for example, attempts to layer short and long-term assistance falling short in contexts like Somalia. And finally, to the third point, as a result of all of this, we unfortunately see ongoing competition around mandates and resources that often thwart. Next slide. And so while we are an equal opportunity critic and cluing of our own work, I thought it would be useful just to kind of pause on this quote and the reflection that extending immediate relief without considering long-term goals may exacerbate the drivers of fragility and sow the seeds of future crises. Next slide. Just to note, I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. Perhaps a reminder, if anyone's not muted, to perhaps. Thank you, sorry about that. Okay, great. So to answer this big picture question of can a resilience agenda increase the alignment and effectiveness of peace, humanitarian development action, and conflict-driven crises, we kind of broke that down into this 4 areas of inquiry. How would a resilience frame define well-being outcomes in protracted conflict-driven crises? What shocks and stresses define these contexts? What sources of resilience matter? And what works best in these contexts to actually drive that change. And we've invested in a number of years of analysis and documentation on this topic, specifically focused on these questions. Next slide. So the answers to these areas of inquiry led us to the following conclusion, which is summarized here in this visual, and I'll just quickly take you through it. The resilience as an organizing framework in conflict-driven crises would elevate peace as a central well-being outcome alongside food security and economic opportunity. It would require foreign assistance, humanitarian peace and development to collectively advance these objectives in a way that protects not just current, but also future well-being. This notion of protecting future prospects for peace, economic opportunity, and food security helps reframe collective outcomes and ways of working in these crisis settings around long-term goals, ensuring these aren't compromised as immediate needs are being met. And advancing these well-being outcomes would be dependent on strengthening households' access to sources of resilience that at a minimum help them better cope and adapt to the shocks and stresses defining protracted crises. It will help them anticipate and prevent the escalation of crisis dynamics and ultimately transform the long-term structural drivers and root causes. And achieving these, we found, is dependent on 3 ingredients for success and areas of alignment that could drive collective action. They're highlighted here on this slide: rapid real-time analysis of risk factors, support to local systems, and short-term violence prevention paired with efforts to transform structural drivers of conflict. And we'll leave the rest of the presentation digging into these areas. Next slide. Actually, next 2 slides, Jenny, one more. Thank you. So while a number of international institutions have begun employing risk and resilience assessments as a way of outlining longer-term strategies for engagement and focus in shock-prone contexts, our first application of our own strategic resilience assessment methodology in protracted crises, this was in Northeast Nigeria, highlighted that these methods are often too slow, too cumbersome, and too removed from local realities on the ground to really inform effective action. We found that shocks and stresses in these contexts, including the threat or presence of armed violence, evolve rapidly and often in unexpected ways, frustrating aid efforts and invalidating strategies. And often the downstream effects from violence are the most acutely felt. So in Northeast Nigeria, the armed insurgency resulted in a series of acute shocks and stressors like shifting blockades, disruptions to livelihood activities, sudden food shortages, restrictions on movements and goods, and new resource-based tensions between communities. And these downstream effects were often reported as more problematic by communities than the conflict itself. Next slide. And sorry, there's one bit of animation there. Just next slide, please. So what we're finding is that analytical hubs focused on ongoing real-time analysis of evolving risk factors can provide the type of insights necessary for organizations to stay ahead of these evolving shocks and stresses, and at a minimum ensure they are strengthening and not undermining critical resilience capacities. So for example, our teams in DRC and Northeast Nigeria link field-based monitoring with open source data to provide a continuous picture of how risks are evolving. In DRC, real-time rumor tracking allowed our Ebola response team to quickly shape new messages that get incorporated into community outreach activities and various broadcasts. And in another case, an analysis of the status of local relationships allowed us to inform how we did voucher transfers to foster positive interaction across groups. So I'll hand it over to John now to talk about our next key ingredient for success.
Thanks, Olga. So the second success factor that we've identified is supporting local systems and institutions that strengthen sources of resilience. And I'm going to preempt some of potential reactions to this. Certainly from our colleagues, we've gotten reactions that are saying, well, that seems well intended, but a bit vague, all the way to that's unrealistic and potentially Pollyannish in the places that, that we're working. So I want to break it down for you all a little bit. Next slide. We've focused really on two main systems, and this is based on our experience and research, that people in fragile contexts tend to rely on the most. The first is market systems, and the second are social systems. Government would obviously tend to come in as a strong third, but as Olga mentioned, in these fragile conflict-affected contexts, the state tends to be weak or limited. Next slide. So on market systems, what we understand to start is that they themselves are adaptable and resilient. So in places like South Sudan, where literally marketplaces have been burnt down, they quickly rebuild to provide both goods and services as well as sources of income to people in need. So the question becomes, you know, how do we harness that and get behind it as humanitarian development and peace practitioners? Next slide. There's a raft of evidence on how functioning markets do support livelihoods and resilience in conflict contexts. Some of the most striking that we have is from Syria. And here we found that across all three regions of Syria, over 2/3 of households lost more than one of their main income sources during the conflict. And that was over the last 10 years. Yet over 1/3 of those found ways to adapt their livelihoods to take on new income sources. And those people were on average more likely to be able to maintain food security, have basic shelter needs met, and better recover economically. So essentially we see this sort of picture of resilience happening even in a context like Syria. And our analysis digging into this really highlighted the role of functioning markets as one of the key sources of people's abilities to take on new livelihoods that did lead to their well-being and recovery. Next slide. So markets is a big topic. So what about markets really mattered in this case? In addition to this sort of physical access to functioning markets, meaning, you know, communities where stores continue to operate, we found that factors like the stability of food prices were really strongly linked to better food security, and in this case, psychosocial well-being, access to loans and remittances as well. And I think an important thing to remember in the bringing the resilience frame into this is there were downward trends in all of these market factors. So certainly there was food price inflation. Certainly, the banking system took a big hit. And yet access to those factors was still strongly linked to people's abilities to cope and recover. So even in situations where there's deteriorating trends, these things tend to be important, if not maybe more important in more stable contexts. Next slide. So despite this growing understanding of the role of markets in crisis, we still see that traditional aid across the board tends to either bypass some of the market supply or market actors, or undermine it through in-kind assistance where needed. So we've got a couple of examples that speak to how a support to market systems approach can be done in some of the most insecure places that we've worked in the last few years. In Syria, it's a strong example of, I think, Food for Peace and potentially office support to Mercy Corps and others to be able to provide subsidies to local bakeries. And in this case, this not only allowed those businesses to continue functioning, but kept prices stable and allowed us and others to reach a much wider group of conflict-affected Syrians. Similarly, in Nigeria, we were grappling with the question of how to target resilience activities towards IDPs and other displaced populations. So in this case, we worked with a poultry producer to be able to sell chicks into some of the camps and garrison towns in northeast Nigeria, which proved to be a very portable asset, so that even when there was further displacement, people were able to sell chicks or chickens, and with a return to both incomes and dietary diversity. Next slide. Social systems is one of these dimensions that is, I think, less well understood than the market side. We are specifically talking here about people's social networks and the sort of the breadth and depth and resources that are available within them for people to deal with shocks and stresses. And if you've ever heard Greg Collins speak about this, you've heard that social capital is one of these critical sources of resilience. But only recently have we really been able to understand better how social connections and social capital are affected by conflict and displacement, and how people can rely on those during those situations. Next slide. So with support from OFDA and in collaboration with colleagues from the Tufts Feinstein Center, we spent a couple of years looking at this question in South Sudan of how social connections operate and how they support coping and recovery. We found that households continue to rely on each other for both material and intangible support, so things like food and shelter, as well as information and psychosocial support, even when some of those connections have been disrupted by conflict. For example, making new connections in protection of civilian camps in South Sudan. Importantly, we also found that the strength and reliability of those connections were strongly linked to well-being outcomes, so both what we're calling objective and subjective sources of resilience, such as food security, as well as the perceived ability to be able to cope with future shocks. So there's a strong link there. Next slide. We were able to take this a few steps further than in the past. I think the assumption around social capital and connections to date has largely been that more is better, and we're sort of trying to quantify this thing. But what we found largely in South Sudan was that the dimensions of reliability and reciprocity within social networks, so people's ability to depend on them when it counted, and the ability to give back support to others, were the most important facets of social connections that predicted or were linked to forms of resilience. And it's also important to note that we found what others have shown before as well, which is, social connections are not an inherent good. There are certainly downsides to them. There are exclusion amongst groups, as you would expect within any kind of a social network. And then oftentimes these linkages come with some obligations that can be at the detriment of basic needs of families. Thanks. So on the evidence of what works, it's a bit thinner when you're looking at social connections and capital. What we do know is that responses that are designed without a clear understanding of how social networks and connections function in a particular context do risk undermining them. And we've got a couple of examples, contrasting examples of cash transfer programs that speak to this. So in South Sudan, we did find evidence that some of the cash programming may have weakened people's connections, as a quote by this female cash recipient kind of attests, saying that her relatives wondered why she was chosen, and as a result think that she doesn't need help and it won't help her anymore. This was largely based on our analysis due to kind of opaque targeting criteria. So people not really understanding why people were chosen, and it causing tensions. In contrast, we have a rigorous impact evaluation in Iraq where we have strong evidence showing that a cash program there has actually increased people's social connections, and in particular their confidence in their abilities to rely on neighboring communities. And here, again, the sort of the targeting criteria may help explain that. There was a much more clear set of proxy means tests used and communicated by local authorities that may have helped to limit that transparency. For all of these, we recognize that building market systems and strengthening social connections is tricky enough in more stable contexts. So this framework kind of lays out a number of options of how to go about doing this kind of work under different conditions of violence, insecurity, and access. I'll leave that for you all to come back to later. Next. The third pillar or ingredient in integrating resilience agenda in protracted crises for us is really pairing short-term violence prevention with efforts to transform structural drivers of conflict. And this is not unique to the resilience agenda. It's certainly part of the third leg of the triple nexus, but it is essential in our minds. Next. And really what this boils down to is trying to bring together two aspects of peace building and conflict management work. One is addressing the short-term conflicts in these contexts, while also addressing some of the longer-term structural drivers. And the way we tend to see this play out is you have groups like the World Bank and others rightly coming in with a theory that the best way to prevent violence is to invest in economic development and good governance. Very welcomed in these contexts. But that tends to be, fairly separate from the work of some of the maybe smaller scale efforts to implement early warning systems and be able to deal with conflict outbreaks in the near term. And we see these two things, needing to work together in order to be able to nip in the bud some conflicts that sort of undermine the bigger enterprise of addressing the structural causes. And I'll wrap up with an example of this from the Middle Belt of Nigeria. This was with through a U.S. government-funded peace-building project between farmers and herders. And the context here, again, relevant to resilience, was an uptick in violence in the Middle Belt following a law that prohibited open grazing. So in terms of this sort of short-term, long-term dynamic, the program integrated sort of short-term measures to try to bring together farmers and herders, and then engage in dispute resolution, building capacity around negotiation, again, to kind of help short-term conflict from not spiraling out of control, while at the same time engaging in joint natural resource management and local governance efforts to be able to address in this case, what was the main drivers or source of conflict between the two groups. And from the RCT we did on that program, we did find strong results that both trust and perceptions of security increase in these areas and between these groups. And again, importantly, this was in the face of a larger, sort of decline in security in the area. So we see this aspect of communities having resilience to being drawn into conflict in surrounding areas. Next slide. And again, here, we recognize that there's a need for a spectrum of how to engage on peace building and conflict management, both short and long term, in different contexts of protracted crises. And we have somewhat of a menu of options that field teams are working with across that. I'll turn it back over to Olga for some summary remarks. Thank you.
Thanks. Just one more slide forward, please, Jenny. So this is really where we want to begin to turn it over to you for kind of reactions, and I'm sure that was kind of a lot to digest. But I think also we just want to highlight some of the ways that we will be considering, we think really need to kind of move forward in order to make these three ingredients possible. And these are outlined in the paper, and we look forward to discussing more enablers and barriers and recommendations with all of you in the breakout groups. But just from our perspective, in order to move these three ingredients to success forward, we see the need to adopt and hold all of ourselves accountable to shared metrics of success. We do what we measure, and if we collectively measure sources of resilience and well-being outcomes that are commonly agreed upon, and if those include social cohesion and peace metrics, we believe that will further alignment and further collective action across our work. Second, we see the need, as per kind of the second ingredient, to shift the assistance bias away from direct delivery and towards working through and in support of local market and social systems. We recognize that there will be very urgent circumstances and exigent circumstances that require that short-term direct delivery, but that should be the exception and not the norm, particularly in protracted crisis contexts that go on year after year. Recommendation 3 speaks to our third ingredient that calls for ensuring peace-building expertise and funds are part and parcel of the design and delivery of what we do in our humanitarian and development programs. And they're not simply just a layer that comes in particular contexts, with what we see also being a lot less funds kind of to support those outcomes. And finally, we want to allow for greater flexibility in mandates and approaches across funding streams to be able to pursue these key ingredients to success and to drive resilience. So I will stop there and hand it back over to Jessie. Thank you.
Thanks, Olga and John. That was really great. So we're going to stay in plenary now for about 15 minutes and give you all time to share initial feedback. And feel free to share general reactions, but while you're thinking, I'm just going to share a couple discussion questions for the group. The first is around, big picture, what in the presentation resonated with you? Do you think a resilience agenda adds to our current thinking on collective impact? From your perch, maybe how does it do so? And then the second question is also just around starting to get at what's missing, so are there other concepts or guiding frames you found to be successful for steering collective impact? Are there other things that you want to get on the table? I know just looking at the roster we have on this event, we have a very rich cross-section of folks in missions, folks in Washington, a broad range of technical and operational experience and backgrounds, and importantly, our conflict experts. So please chime in if you feel so inclined, just from your respective perch, because I know it's just super valuable for us. So with that, I'll open it up and look forward to hearing your thoughts. And I'll just share a first question that I'm seeing from the chat box. So Jamie Montgomery has asked, you mentioned the need for real-time monitoring earlier in the presentation. How real-time does the monitoring need to be in order to be useful? Olga and John, over to you.
Thanks, Jamie. That's definitely a good question and perhaps a challenging one. I think we find that in a lot of the countries where we do this type of crisis analytics, at least weekly reports seem to be essential to support our teams in pivoting and adjusting their information in very subtle but important ways to respond to potentially evolving risk dynamics. So for example, I mentioned in DRC, the spread of rumors around Ebola has the potential to kind of spur small scale outbreaks of violence, on a daily basis. Somebody hears something, they react to it, they go do something, that outbreak of violence in itself can then spur, other downstream effects, further cause violence, etc. And So we find that actually having at least weekly reports of these types of contexts can allow us to shape our messaging differently, think about who we reach out to differently, examine how we're linking communities in certain events. We continuously analyze relationships across communities to be able to understand what's the best way to deliver some of that humanitarian assistance. So, I mean, in short, the answer is has been weekly, but of course that might not be possible in all of these contexts. But we find that really having on the ground teams that have their ear close to the situation and combine that with secondary data to get a close picture of what's happening has been essential for us to stay ahead of unfolding crisis dynamics.
And I'm seeing another question in the chat box that was actually my third plenary discussion question that I didn't say for the sake of keeping it a little more simple. So DeBerry asks, how can resilience interventions contribute to peace building? And yeah, over to John and Olga.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are several dimensions here, but as mentioned a bit in the presentation, if we are building the capacities for households to cope and adapt in crisis situation, we are strengthening social networks, we are promoting social cohesion, but importantly, we're also preserving sources of incomes and livelihoods that give households some sense of agency and some control over their lives, even in these crisis settings. We're able to preserve markets and markets functionality, which continue to be a source of employment and local entrepreneurship in crisis settings. That in turn helps to thwart some potential drivers of future conflict, right? If you're preserving, let's say, a local economic activity through resilience interventions, you are contributing to local employment and entrepreneurship in a way that could reduce kind of economic drivers of conflict. Similarly, by strengthening social networks, by connecting citizens across each other, by being transparent in the way we deliver assistance, we are potentially also thwarting this perception, these grievances and perceptions of exclusion that also can contribute to violent conflict. So there's explicit peace building interventions, and then there's the ways that we get at peace building through building other resilience capacities that help households cope and adapt in these contexts and also prevent risks from unfolding. John, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
No, nothing to add, but there's a good related question from a colleague in Haiti asking about how does that apply to gang and criminally motivated violence, which I would have to throw back to the group.
I'm also seeing a follow-up, maybe just to follow through on the thread. So Carrie asks, in the DRC example, is the real-time monitoring integrated into Ebola response or local livelihoods programming? You mentioned that it can help stay ahead of the dynamics, or is it being implemented through a separate peace-building activity?
Yeah, thanks. And just to note, we have Danielle Jolicoeur on the line as well, who's our Africa Resilience Director. And I won't put her on the spot, but she can feel free to jump in if she wants, just with more responses. But our analytical hubs are currently separately funded, but often connect to and gather some information from our program teams' routine and regular monitoring activities. So it is a separate funded analytical hub, but also uses program data and the way program systems are set up for real-time information gathering to do the analysis.
I also just wanted to note, I'm seeing a couple of really great questions in the chat box that I want to flag, but then maybe they're best brought up in the breakout room discussions because they really get at some of the key challenges that we know we're going to be facing. And we want to really have a deliberate conversation around that in the breakout rooms. So one is from Jennifer Karsner, one of our biggest challenges is programming in environments where the active conflicts are patchy in space. We have restrictions on operating in areas on the border of active conflicts. And then, so that's just a great operational barrier. And then a bigger picture question from David. It's my sense that the concept of collective outcomes and shared metrics has been discussed for several years. what are the obstacles you have identified to achieving those, not the least the very different planning timeframes of humanitarian development and peace actors. So I think, both those operational issues in terms of how do I get to the place when there's a patchy enabling environment, but then also these different planning timeframes are really great points that we would just love folks to throw in the pot again when we get to the breakout rooms. And then I might highlight too, because I'm seeing some interesting threads just about when we're talking about local systems. I think it's a great question for Olga and John. The conversation focused on social systems and market systems. How are you thinking about and regarding these other kinds of local systems, whether it's governance, civil society, et cetera, especially for what we know are these very tricky contexts?
Yeah, I might just respond quickly that the idea or the bucket of supporting social systems definitely includes the need to support and work through often local informal institutions that may provide institutions that often provide alternative sources of legitimacy and support and even services to crisis affected populations. I think the challenge is that, as we said, governance, kind of formal government may be broken or predatory in many of these contexts, but we find that governance at a more local level still exists and is essential to helping communities manage and mitigate some of these factors in these crisis settings, and actually preventing also crisis dynamics from evolving. So we definitely see that as part of the umbrella under the social systems discussion. And there might be, I don't know if Lisa or others potentially in the breakout groups, we could bring out examples of where we've supported local institutions and informal institutions in our peace building intervention. Certainly the work that John mentioned in Northeast Nigeria had that dimension in it. I will say that I think there's more room for research in that space to really understand what works and how to partner with these local institutions to advance governance goals. But that is certainly part of that social systems, an essential part of that social systems umbrella.
And I wanted to turn over to Jamie for a question. Sorry for missing you in the...
No, thank you. I'll try turning on my camera. So thanks a lot. A great presentation, and really appreciated the findings and the recommendations that you highlighted. My question really had to do around, so the examples that you highlighted are ones that where, there's definitely an issue with external actors kind of also injecting themselves into the conflict dynamics. And I'm just curious whether these recommendations and findings, what's your sense of, because I know you've done, a lot of work in other contexts as well. Do these hold across other settings where the conflict dynamics are more local in the case of, say, resource conflict dynamics versus, or in contexts where perhaps the grievances are really more internal to the country, people sort of reacting against perceived issues with their government or other stakeholders in the country. So would you still have these sort of same framing, or is it different depending on what's driving the conflict? Over.
Thanks, Jamie. I'd love to throw that one to Lisa, our conflict specialist. I think if you picture back that framework with those kind of three spheres, we would probably say that making progress on some of the conflict prevention, conflict management goals is more possible at a local level in those sort of first two. So the sort of the most fluid and insecure, and those where this is a bit more permissible and maybe, as you say, characterized by, let's say, intercommunal tensions versus addressing some of the bigger political, economic, governance grievances at a national level. Obviously depends on sort of, mandates and authorities, but, often not possible or advisable so much in early stages of an acute crisis. So I guess it's sort of it depends, but I think the framework is trying to, again, lay out sort of a spectrum of what is worth trying under what conditions.
Thanks, John. Just since you called this out, I think one thing I would add, I agree with that. I think it's still possible to do some work at a local level with, for example, youth who might be drawn to join violent groups by addressing some of the grievances they might have at the community level, you know, enabling opportunity, building connections across groups, across division. And at the same time, if you can do that while sort of waiting to address some of those larger structural national level issues. So you could do that violence prevention in the short term at a very local level as well.
And I'm going to turn to Chris Upchurch from State F for our next question.
Thanks very much, Olga and John. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. Thanks very much for the presentation this morning. I wanted to ask you about the fourth recommendation you had for the way forward on allowing for greater flexibility in mandates and across funding streams. It seems to me that requires very adept leadership to overcome the either actual bureaucratic impediments to that or the sort of defensive actions that organizations take to protect what they see as being their space. So I wonder if you could just expand on that a little bit for us. Appreciate it. Thanks.
I hate to punt this one, Chris, but I think this is the part where we hand it over to you guys and say, how do you want to grapple with some of these issues? I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I guess we can be very transparent in the fact that, you know, we see this kind of competition over mandates or resources or misalignment of timeframes, which was also brought up in the chat box. Or perceptions of what is and isn't humanitarian assistance, which should and shouldn't be included in that bucket. We've seen that play out in very challenging ways in our own programming, but I don't think we actually have as good insight as we would like into the ins and outs of the machine that is USAID, and whether, as you're saying, how much of this is perceptions and kind of protection of ways of working that aren't really codified but are just cultural perhaps, and how much of it is sort of bureaucratic impediments that require kind of a fundamental operational shift. So we hope actually to really dig into that with you guys and learn loads in the breakout group. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you, but I think that's where the limit of our insights, we've kind of reached the limit of our insights and knowledge on that front.
And I just wanted to read a really thoughtful question comment from Laura Meisner. And I don't think anyone's obligated to answer it, but I'll just read it out loud. And if you do feel like you have a great answer, that's super too. I see too many well-intentioned interventions trying to kill two birds with one stone, but missing both. For example, trying to keep people from joining armed groups by supporting livelihoods. But the focus on violence prevention means it's not a well-designed livelihoods intervention. And so it doesn't succeed on either front. How can we promote adherence to good practice and technical quality when we take a more expansive view of objectives? Yeah, I thought that was super. And feel free to chime in if you have thoughts, but I also just wanted to share it with the group. I'm also seeing that we are getting an avalanche of really smart comments that for the sake of plenary, we do not actually have the ability to discuss. So I'm hoping folks, if you've added a comment in the past 2 or 3 minutes, I hope you can carry those over into the breakout rooms, which we will be shifting to in just a moment. And I mean, this plenary discussion was really a chance to get the ball rolling and to get the juices flowing for thinking about this issue set. And thank you for delivering on that, because I'm just seeing a lot of really interesting points here. We will carve out a little time in the beginning of the breakout groups just to loop back to some of these bigger picture questions and comments and things like that. but then we'll be turning to a couple specific topics. And Jenny, actually, if you wouldn't mind sharing a slide with the discussion topics for our breakout rooms. So we have breakout rooms up ahead, and this is a chance again to share more of those comments in a smaller setting. And first, we're going to be focusing on 3 promising practices that John and Olga discussed. But again, just as the hook to get the conversation started, that's already happening in the chat box. And we're interested in, what resonates and what is missing there. And then we want to shift, and again, this will probably happen naturally in the conversation. It's honestly already happening just in this plenary discussion, to discussing what are those key enablers and barriers to applying these practices. And knowing the crew of folks that we have online right now, I think the session is a nice time to share your experiences with where you've seen USAID both get things right and wrong, as well as maybe what your thoughts could be on recipes for success and things like that. So now I will turn things over to Jenny, who will just talk through the tech side of our breakout rooms for a second, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, let's see, it's not letting me go to the next screen here. Just one second, let's see if I can. Okay, so just a couple of pointers if you haven't used Zoom breakouts yet in these past few months. Everyone is going to get assigned to a breakout room. So all you need to do is accept the prompt when it pops up on your screen. We'll have a facilitator and a note taker in each group. If you can turn your cameras on, it's great for discussion. And we'll have about 30 minutes total for the discussion. So we'll have a couple broadcasts when we're about halfway through, so that we're just, making sure we, keeping track of time. And then you'll have a 1-minute warning at the end. But then you will be automatically returned to plenary at the end of that. So don't be shocked, but you'll just come back into the group and we'll wrap up from there. So with that, I think Zubaida is gonna go ahead and shift us into breakouts. Thanks.
Who will be leading us through discussing the small groups and some of those interesting synthesis points that came out.
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, we wanted to take about 10-15 minutes here to just go around briefly from each group and kind of hear top line points that you had. Ideally kind of one enabler and barrier. We can get into some of that analytical part and maybe kind of one big outstanding question that we need to tackle to better understand this agenda. I hope that someone either will step forward from each group or you all appointed someone. Let's just go down the list. So for group 1, is there someone that can give us a 2-minute summary?
I'm group 1, and I can see if anyone wants to chime in for key takeaways, but otherwise I can step in. So I guess I'll put myself on the hook too to say that we did not get to discuss enablers and barriers, although everyone filled out their stickies super well. We stayed focused on the first set of conversations, and there's a couple interesting takeaways I just wanted to note. For what resonated, the idea of working through local systems was just very strong and resonated a lot with a lot of folks in the group, both on the market system side, but also on the social system side. And then the other key sort of like area for agreement was just around the importance of shared metrics and this idea that you do what you measure. That came out really strongly, and we had a nice conversation around that. Then when it came to the sort of like what's missing, I would say that the biggest thread throughout everyone's comments was just about this idea of like, these contexts are complex, they're politically complex. There's whether it's external forces or how do you do localized gang prevention when it's a systemic thing, or what does it look like on the one hand, we discussed how working in a localized way when you don't have that government support in a legitimate way is really important, but then how are you stitching it together with broader systems? And one point that came out that I thought was really helpful, drawing from experience from DRC, was just this idea that even if it feels unclear, it's really important to be engaging with local systems from the beginning, local institutions with more of a political flavor, and at least recognizing if and how you're engaging, especially when it comes to those peace building processes. So that was an interesting conversation. And otherwise, we didn't have too many, clear takeaways there, but just I think this broad recognition that it's tricky, and we're not going to we might need to have very localized and context specific answers to this. So over.
Thanks, Jesse, for volunteering for that first group. I'm going to take a few of these down and try to see if there's common themes across. But if group 2 could do a similarly succinct high-level summary. Anybody from there, please?
I think that's us. And sorry, we didn't assign a rapporteur, so I guess I'll take this on as well. And then if anybody from the group wants to jump in, please go ahead. I guess I'll highlight one point under each of the 4 buckets. I mean, with what resonates, there was kind of, I think, a resounding affirmation from the group that this idea of including short-term violence prevention and the analysis that has to go with that in order to be able to do that well really needs to be part and parcel of this resilience agenda. And it seems that there's this void that humanitarian actors who are, grappling with really difficult contexts and find themselves in the midst of violence don't really have the tools to do this. And then when the development actors come in, it's not part of their funding. So this piece really needing to sit squarely within the resilience agenda and protracted crises context. On the kind of, not so much disagreement, but something that we need to consider more, and John, you alluded to this in the presentation, what is that social systems are, can be sources of resilience and can be inherently problematic, depending on the particular dynamic. So really when we think about strengthening systems, how do we ensure that they serve as a source of resilience for more people and not are sort of, drivers of conflict in themselves? And so understanding kind of what works to support social systems to kind of expand the pie, so to speak, and make them better. On the enablers and barriers, we talked quite a bit about funding, and one enabler was obviously that there has been a lot of progress in funding flexibility, but there is ongoing challenges in the fact that kind of funding cycles do not line up, and so there isn't really opportunities to kind of think about longer term agendas as part of shorter term responses. But I thought one particularly critical insight was that resilience funding seems to kind of still sit within this focus of food security and natural shocks and ecological shocks. And it isn't currently seen as something that would fund sort of other types of crises, potentially in some of these other types of activities related to violence prevention and peace building. It's primarily dominated by sort of agriculturally focused programming designed to address climate risks. And so how can we sort of think more broadly about resilience funding responding to multiple types of shocks and needs? I'll stop there.
Thanks, Olga, and apologies for not opening this up to others in the group to kind of weigh in, but this is rich. So group 3.
Sure, yeah, we also didn't quite get to the nomination stage for a speaker, so I'll share a few highlights. We dwelt on a little bit on sort of what's missing from the framework, and a few things that came out was building on this conversation from the plenary about there's a concern about the technical quality of design and interventions when we have certain outcomes but approaches that draw from other sectors. So how can we ensure that sort of technical quality and also achieve sort of true integration in not just the design but also the implementation, having the right people there who can really advance technical excellence. We also talked a little bit in terms of what's missing or what we could build upon is making sure that localization piece is really highlighted, and how can we ensure that we're really delivering what people in communities want with regard to local systems. And then we also talked about needing to adapt the model for situations like refugee situations where the local markets may not be there, or the local systems may really need to be built up. And how is that different? And then on the enablers and barriers side, we talked a lot. I'll start with the barriers because I think the enablers sort of address some of those. You know, sort of within USAID, some of our colleagues, and please feel free to jump in to explain more, but there's can be a reluctance or an unwillingness to lean in across sectors. And part of this is this impression that you just can't do one or the other. There's a lack of evidence about what we can achieve. And then there's related to that sort of weak coordination unless you have sort of one champion driving forward two different sets of outcomes. And then in terms of enablers that might address that, we talked a lot about shared metrics, being realistic about what we can achieve so that we don't necessarily fall short, and also having shared metrics that allow us to adapt and then demonstrate that evidence that's going to increase coordination. So I'll stop there.
Okay, that was a full page of my notes. Thanks for making it easy for me to summarize. The next group is for Gian. You were going to share from our side.
Yes. So I think there's some emergent themes that are happening over here. So I think our discussion echoes a lot of the points that have already been presented by the three groups. Generally, there's a huge appreciation for the importance of local markets and social systems in our group, as others have mentioned. But it remains kind of unclear in terms of evidence of how best to engage these groups, or rather the local communities. And in particular, one comment that came up is working within community versus across communities, and how do you balance both, especially in context of conflict and potential grievances. Another point that came up that was that somebody in our group mentioned was missing is how and when do we effectively engage governments, and how do these interact with the local support systems that we have talked about, and having greater guidance and evidence base to do this effectively is something that that is required to push forward. Pushing towards enablers and barriers, I think an enabler is a greater appreciation and recognition for a need for longer term humanitarian programming, and appreciation that this triple nexus framework presents an opportunity for the different sectors to come together. That being said, as others have mentioned, given the different timelines, different mandates, and the principles by which these different actors operate, how do we effectively come together and coordinate across these sectors to truly implement the nexus activities remains a question to be seen. But the fact that there is a greater recognition and for the need to do so, I think is something that many in our group felt like it would be a great enabler. I'll pause there because other points were repetitive with other groups.
Super. And do we have a group 5? Anyone?
Yes, that's my group. I will give a quick synthesis, adding just a few things to what others have mentioned. We agreed with other groups. There were a lot of cards that there is this having a common vision and uniting different sectors was really important and good. Having education and health, for instance, have a common vision, and how that can inform geographic targeting and activity clustering. That resonated, makes a lot of sense. We talked more about what might be missing, and the discussion on missing reflected a lot of the same kind of thoughts around barriers. So one thing that came out that I thought was interesting is this, how important access to justice is as a key element or source of resilience within the broader bucket of peace building efforts and violence prevention. And looking at how informal or traditional systems really play a critical role in that. And we didn't get too into depth on this, but it just seemed that having that, perspective of informal versus formal, very context dependent, but also just critical to really get the understanding of how justice or other kind of triggers of conflict might be something that undermines any efforts that we might take at a community level. Another component that was missing was or could be linked to a barrier. It's understanding the nuance between political will versus structural incentives to kind of work this way. So there may be a desire to work towards common objectives, and this is really thinking about community or local or national institutions or actors that we would partner with. There may be that desire, that political will, but the personal reward systems could be misaligned for local actors to really engage in this agenda. And one comment that I thought was interesting is, this kind of understanding of political will and structural incentives needs to happen at each level. So the comment was, we won't be successful at the Laredo level unless we have success at the national level. So yes, we must focus on those local systems, but at the same time, understand how they're nested within those national hierarchies. One interesting enabler, I think that our group focused a little bit more on what structures are in place in communities. And we talked about how religious leaders and traditional leaders can really play a key role to drive social change or really be an influential figure in a resilience approach. Recognizing they could also be barriers, but how investing a little bit more in them could be an important factor for success. Over.
Wow. Okay. I'm drowning in notes over here, so I'm not going to even try to do justice to sort of tying a bow around all of that, and I don't think we need to. The point was really just to kind of spur some really rich discussion, which we clearly had. I guess a few things that maybe are kind of overarching points of maybe tension or areas where we clearly need to invest more time, thought, effort. I've got two, and then I think maybe Olga, if you have any, or Jesse. One is there seems to be I'm going to call it a tension between the streams of funding that are going into a resilience agenda or a triple nexus or whatever we're wanting to call it, and those not always being necessarily conducive to integration. So even in theory, when that's our collective aim, those flavors of funding or appropriations don't allow for it to come together. And from my side, I think there's sort of both a kind of a technical fix for that, of trying to understand how different sectors, streams of funding, parts of U.S. government fit in. So for example, Nina Weisenhorn had a good question earlier in the plenary about, okay, how does education fit in to support social systems? And I know they've done a good job of kind of laying out a framework of education and resilience. So at least conceptually, people can kind of see, yeah, this is our piece. And then the others is what people have brought up around, sort of incentives to allow that piece to play its role. And I won't try to touch that in terms of U.S. government, but it's clear based on some of the transformation of USAID, at least, that there are opportunities there. And the second one that I see is this kind of tension between a need to be working, really nimbly at a often very local level, understanding local dynamics, responding to them, and that being a kind of a prerequisite to being effective, or at least doing no harm, and recognizing that that's inherently limited in terms of our reach. So the need to still think about scale and dealing with sort of more transformational issues. And in our group, that came up in terms of, look, at some point we need to be able to work through government social protection systems. And, in the face of COVID, it's really clear that those are make or break in terms of response. So how do you do that when those systems are non-existent or nascent? So I think grappling with a bit of that question around scale and sort of level at which we're working at on this agenda comes to the fore for me. Jesse, I'm going to shift it over to you to see if you have any other potentially more insightful reactions and or thoughts on kind of next steps.
I'll focus on more instead of more insightful, just to moderate expectations. But I just wanted to flag a couple things I heard too, because I completely agreed with all those tension points. Those really came out in our conversation, then clearly across groups. I feel like I heard some interesting areas too, where there was an appetite for, doing things differently moving forward, or where we see connections. And it seems like both in other groups and in our group, shared metrics that are realistic and that can also handle adaptive management was just something that seemed quite consistent. That was something that there was an appetite and interest for, as well as I liked the comments. It came out in different ways, but this idea of like, you don't want to dilute the technical quality of these things when we're tacking on social cohesion, we're tacking on, or it's the livelihoods program to do this. But it really speaks, it feels like in a way to the new R3 structure and just integrating really thoughtfully with our colleagues. You know, it's both about the technical design of the activity, but it's about how we're interacting and collaborating and in touch with each other so we can get the super smart conflict expert to chime in to make sure that social cohesion dimension is really thoughtful and good. So I really appreciated hearing that. And then also just this idea of the emphasis on localization and local systems was just quite pervasive. So it's nice. It's there's always going to be things we disagree about. It seems helpful when, even if the how is unclear and not completely, you know, sorted out, and there's all sorts of just, you know, tricky issues to figure out, the sort of fact of it, of working with and through local systems, to me was just quite clear. So I'm looking at time, and we're near the end of our time together. I want to turn us to what comes next and what that could look like. And there's one discrete way that we're moving forward that's just sort of yeah, like sort of like a smaller piece in this grander puzzle. But we will be taking all of the rich feedback that we heard today from this great group of folks and putting that into a revised version of this thought piece that will be released under our Resilience Award with the Center for Resilience. And maybe this is something that we'll be sharing out for comment again too, just so we feel like we're really capturing what folks are saying and bringing that in. But this is a much broader conversation, and there's just so many equities and different ways it could go. I wanted to create space for folks to share any final thoughts that they have on these larger issues that are at stake. What else do we want to be taking forward with this agenda? What needs to happen to help move it forward? It could be along the lines of some of those kind of like themes and takeaways that John and I mentioned, or anything that really comes to mind. And I'm thinking about that in two major buckets. You know, like one is what key steps are needed across actors. So, you know, we're benefiting from our Mercy colleagues here today, you know, from IPs to within USAID, both at missions and in Washington. You know, what do we need to be advancing the plot across different actors? But then also what kind of work needs to be done? It could be about technical work streams and evidence, or just about operational and procurement issues, or just figuring out how do we do those shared metrics. So to me, those are some of just the broader buckets to spur conversation. I also know there's been really rich comments in the chat box, so please feel free to use some of these final minutes too, to share those chat box comments to the group, or otherwise chime in on some of those next steps that you see. And I'll also just read comments that I'm seeing as folks think and reflect on these next steps. So Nina is sharing, on the R3 structure, while promising for bridging conflict peace, HA and food security is promising. It raises concerns for me for the inclusion of development in this nexus, and to what John spoke about on the inclusion of other sectors. Yeah, I think that's a great comment. I in a way, I almost didn't want to overstate the R3 structure. It felt like a timely hook for this conversation, but it can also be limiting, and it's not quite getting at all of the super important equities that we need to be having in this conversation, of course.
Just one thought for me as we talk about sort of this triple nexus in this space where all these interesting pieces come together. You know, really understanding what each stakeholder's purpose is, what their objective is, what their agenda is. You know, kind of the blinders that we bring to the table as we engage in this conversation, I think is really critical. And I'll just give an example within sort of the connection between social protection systems and humanitarian cash. You know, one of the things that has come out as to, you know, why it's such a challenge for those two to interface, they have different objectives, right? A humanitarian cash assistance is coming in protecting livelihoods, saving lives. They want to reach a targeted amount of people with an impactful amount of cash that's going to make a difference for them. And a social protection system has a longer term view that wants to reach the maximum people with a minimum transfer, right? So owning that and understanding what those differences are when you come together to program is critical. And I feel like, you know, one of the stumbling blocks for this sort of triple nexus is that we have such different goals, and I don't know that we necessarily own them. And it's not that that's bad, you know, it's that collective outcomes and collective actions, each person brings their piece of the puzzle and we build the puzzle together. Not everyone does the same thing, right? And so I feel like that's kind of a stumbling block in an opportunity to say, you know, as a humanitarian, my goal is to uphold humanitarian principles. As a development person, I want to layer and sequence effectively on this and have it be meaningful. And as a policy person, this is what I want to change in government. So, you know, understanding those and how to then make them work together while everyone is still achieving their individual purpose and a bigger purpose is so difficult. But anyway, I'm blabbing. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. No, that was great. And it also looked like Doreen might have gone off mute for a second. So Doreen, did you have anything you wanted to share?
Yeah, I think I was reflecting on this whole, you know, the nexus between humanitarian and development assistance, as well as the whole idea of flexibility in terms of funding streams, in terms of, you know, different mechanisms. And I think there's opportunity to use the existing flexible guidance as well as the CLA framework for opportunities to be a bit more creative. I think part of the challenge there is just shedding off the old mindsets of how we've done programming generally, but even when it comes to resilience, even as we achieve the objectives that are very sectoral, it's important to look at the context that we're working and consider which are those drivers of resilience. For example, I'll use one of the examples that we talk about a lot in northern Kenya, where you have up to 97% illiteracy levels. So how effective will you be if you do not include education, literacy, life skills in that space, if you're only looking at food security and or you're looking at food security and humanitarian assistance alone? So I think sometimes we gotta be willing to push the envelope a bit and look at exactly how creative we can be within the context that we have and with the resources that we actually have. And I think we've seen a much greater willingness amongst implementing partners than internally within USAID to push the envelope, to be creative, to look at how we can leave a legacy. And even now, as we talk about the journey to self-reliance, how can we shift our mindsets and include those perspectives in the programming that falls under resilience? And I think in Kenya, we've basically gone all out in terms of including any sector that works within the geographical zone that is characterized as the resilience zone. So just wanted to put that out there as something for consideration.
Thanks, Doreen. I think that was super helpful. I'm looking at time, and time is up, which is, it's too bad, but I know I really enjoyed this conversation with all of you. And I just wanted to quickly flag, so I might go 2 minutes over, some of those potential next steps that I see and just ways in which we do want feedback from this group of folks. This was a really rich discussion. I think it raises the question of, do we want more of these targeted discussions that dig in a deeper level, you know, down one level or more targeted? And that's something I think we'd be happy to solicit feedback on. Then there's also the question for folks at missions too, how can this feed into how we're supporting you in general, but then also with our resilience-focused countries. And then we want to be channeling this feedback into that new thought piece. And I think that's another great opportunity to be engaging with this room and to keep this conversation going, because I think a 2-hour event is sort of just the tip of the iceberg for this issue set and this problem set. I know for me, I'm personally just excited that we're having the conversation, and it's a really good one, and it makes me feel positive and excited for the path forward. With that, and I do want to just tie things in a bow and let folks go on with their day. I want to say a big thank you to Mercy Corps and to everyone else here for your time and contributions. You know, this was really enjoyable. I've really appreciated everyone's effort over the past couple hours, and yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation together. So with that, thanks again, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thank you for spending the past couple hours with us.